I want to take you with me on a flight to Newcastle, a real smooth flight today, as usual. And therefore, please imagine you are in a modern cockpit, not just surrounded by the systems, but supported by them. An autopilot that stabilizes the aircraft, corrects deviations, prevents mistakes before they happen. And for most of the flights, it works perfectly. And that is the point. Because the better the systems become, the less you need to intervene, the less you need to think, and the less you need to decide. Until something really unexpected happens. Multiple systems starts failing, the autopilot disengages, and suddenly everything depends on one thing. Not the system, but the person in the seat. His ability to decide under pressure with incomplete information. Now, here's an uncomfortable question. What happens when we build systems that work so well that people slowly lose the ability to decide or take over when it's needed? Right at the moment, we are living through an era of constant pressure, technological acceleration, and geopolitical tension. Systems that are more connected than ever and more fragile than ever before. And we are asking our institutions that were designed for stability to operate under permanent disruption. And that changes the role of our systems, because resilience is no longer about keeping everything stable, it is about remaining capable of acting when something unexpected happens. Our instinctive response to this pressure is and was for decades to build more control, more rules, more processes, more oversight. And to be clear, in former times, this was a real breakthrough. During industrialization, especially here in the UK, rules were not bureaucracy, they were pure survival. Workplace regulation, for example, and standardization helped drive both safety and productivity. GDP increased significantly as systems became more and more structured. So control created reliability, reliability created scale, and scale created prosperity. In a way, control was something like the first form of autopilot. It stabilized the systems, reduced human error, and made outcomes more predictable. But something has changed since then. The risks we face today are no longer only physical. They are systemic. They evolve faster than rules can be written for that. They cross boundaries, and they do not wait for process. And beyond this certain point, more control does not automatically create more safety. It can start to replace thinking. Like an autopilot that becomes so reliable that the pilot stops paying attention to it. Until this moment where intervention is required and the capability is no longer there. I remember sitting in a room with a group of highly experienced people in the German welfare system. It was a tense situation. It was about child abuse. Time mattered. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. And what struck me was this. Everyone understood the situation. Everyone knew what the right decision was, and still no one made it. I was part of that room, and you could feel it. People were careful, measured, looking at each other, not because they didn't care, and not because they didn't know what to do, but because responsibility had become so distributed, so proceduralized, that stepping forward no longer felt like an option for anyone in the room. So the system was still running and the autopilot was still on. But no one was ready to take control. That moment stayed really with me because it revealed something deeper. Sometimes systems do not fail because people make the wrong decision. They fail because no one is still able to make one. And that, of course, is not an isolated moment. I guess you know, every one of you know such a decision. You can observe this pattern in many public systems today, in administration, in healthcare, in security environments. So let's take a real type of situation. In parts of modern healthcare services, for example here, of course, in the NHS, the professionals are highly trained, but increasingly constrained by protocols. A patient is waiting for a treatment decision. Time matters. The case is not standard. It does not fully match the guidelines. So what's happened? The case is not, the medical team understands the situation. They know what should be done. But the decision triggers multiple protocols, documentation requirements, liability considerations. So the case is escalated, documented, reviewed, re-reviewed, reassessed, and of course sometimes delayed. Not because knowledge is unclear or missing, but because the ownership is unclear. Or take a different context, a security-relevant situation. The people involved have experience, they have judgment, but responsibility is distributed across multiple roles, levels, and procedures. So everyone contributes, but no one decides. And this pattern is not limited to public systems. In many organizations today, decisions are not made where knowledge is, but where approval is. Meetings multiply, responsibility is shared, and paradoxically, ownership disappears. What we see here is not only inefficiency, it is something more fundamental. So we became very good at reducing risk. We define processes, we add controls, and we distribute responsibilities. And step by step, we moved uncertainty out of the system. But something else disappears as well, and this is ownership. Until in this critical moment, something very strange happens. A decision is needed, but there is no one left who is able to make it. Not because people are unwilling, but because responsibility had been fragmented, absorbed, and quietly transferred into the system itself. The autopilot is still running, but no one remembers how to fly. What remains is a vacuum, a decision vacuum. This is what I call responsibility gap, a gap between formal control and the actual ability to act. Systems become safer on paper, but less capable in reality. Responsibility is not removed overnight. It is slowly engineered out, not by bad intentions, but by design, a design of the last century. And this brings us finally to resilience. Resilience is often misunderstood. It is not stability. It is not the absence of disruption, and it is not compliance. Resilience is the ability to decide and act under uncertainty and pressure. It is what remains when the autopilot no longer works, and no amount of rules can replace that. And this pattern does not stop at organizations. It scales to institutions, even to societies. And the same question applies here. How do we design systems that are safe without removing the ability to act? Different systems answer this differently. Some, like the US, optimize for speed. Some, like China, for control. Europe has often tried to combine both with an additional constraint, trust. And that is not easy, to be honest, but it points to something important. If we get this right, this is not a weakness in the game of the systems, it's our European advantage. Because ability to act under pressure without losing legitimacy may become one of the most critical capabilities in the systems we are building, but only if we allow it. In transnational crises, we often see alignment without execution. Statements are coordinated, positions are agreed on, but when it comes to action, responsibility becomes diffuse. Coordination alone is not enough, because coordination is not action. In complex, interconnected crises, responsibility cannot stop at alignment level. It has to extend to execution. And that requires something we often overlook. Not more control, but more ownership. Sometimes you have to give up control to remain capable of acting. So, what does this mean for us here in this room? Not as policymakers, not as system designers, but as individuals. Because this pattern is not abstract, it shows up in small moments, everywhere, at any place, in meetings, in decisions, in situations where something is unclear. Responsibility is shared, and in those moments, we all have a choice. We can stay within the system, or we can just step forward, not by breaking the rules, but by taking ownership. So maybe the question is not, what does the process require, but where is my personal responsibility in this? Because responsibility is not something systems can assign to us. Responsibility is something we have to take. And in the end, resilience is not defined by the systems we build, but by whether we are still able and willing to take control when it matters. Thank you all.